Welcome to litigation avoidance, which is very important for any business person. Not only is it expensive, time-consuming, but it usually winds up destroying your business, destroying your social life, destroying your marriage life, and everything that you ordinarily have time to do is spent working on the case. Basically, it becomes 24/7 in taking care of the litigation. So what can you do to reduce litigation is what we're going to be talking about in this session. First thing we're going to do is cover the objectives, understand why litigation is rarely the answer, discuss methods of litigation avoidance, describing legal issues that impact the financial planner, and finally explaining the alternatives to litigation. Preventing litigation, and again, prevention is better than litigation. There's no comparison. The entire litigation process can take for as little as 6 months to as long as years. It's not uncommon for business lawsuits to take 2 or 3 years through the judicial system, and that's again assuming that it isn't appealed to a higher court. So if you appeal to a higher court, say state Supreme Court or United States Circuit Court of Appeals, you can add another year or two to the process. In the case of witnesses, you can call to testify at any time from shortly after the event to a better part of a decade after it happened. And how much can you remember of happening 5 years ago, much less 10 years ago on something? In fact, if you think about it, how many can tell me where you were working and what you were doing 10 years from now is very difficult. And yet you may be asked to testify about it. And of course, if you testify and it's wrong, they're going to accuse you of perjury. So you never know what to expect on these things, which take forever to get through the system. Generally speaking, the less money at stake and the more issues that can be resolved before trial, the smoother and faster the lawsuit would be. But again, let's not try to count on that as being the answer for everything. If you win the lawsuit after 2 years from the event, the court judgment, which is not a short, that's a short time actually for getting this judgment made, and that I really strongly believe in the following: the easy part is getting the judgment, the hard part is collecting on it. That's been said by a number of attorneys, and it's proven. People are good at not being able to have money available. They hide it. And certainly if you think you're going to lose a litigation, you do whatever is necessary that doesn't show up. Avoidance of litigation. One thinks of the term litigation avoidance, he or she is thinking of mediation rooms, negotiations, and costly settlements to avoid a lengthy trial or lawsuit. In fact, I generally say that in many cases you're better off taking a big financial cut now and get it over with than put up with that long lawsuit that could cost you your job, your social life, and even your health in many cases. The truth is, litigation avoidance strategies are simply ways in which a business can alter or improve its practice to avoid potential conflicts with clients, customers, patients, employees, vendors, and others. In other words, what can we do that's simple that reduces their litigation? Many times litigation avoidance is only thought of after a dispute arises, but the best time to think about it is before costly and time-consuming litigation is imminent. Hold on a second. Best method to avoid potential litigation is by anticipating problems, by developing, planning, implementing best practices and operational policies that are specific for your company and the service you offer. First of all, legal review of all contracts prior to execution. Have the attorney recommend changes to avoid claims. So often people will have attorneys spend time writing a contract, then they sit down and negotiate it, and they come up and try to be their own attorney to save time or money. And what happens is they get later litigation because they did not do the right thing that they should have from a legal standpoint. Have the lawyer always review the document before it is approved as a contract. I know there used to be jokes that said that in New York, the contract doesn't exist till the lawyer says it exists. That is actually a good statement, and I would certainly go with it. A handshake is not an answer for a contract. Too many unknowns will come out of it. Training supervisors and program managers to avoid actions that could result in claims. We've talked about employment and how, as an employer, you have responsibilities to your clients, to your employees and to your clients. But again, many times lawsuits come up from employees who feel like they didn't get treated correctly, they got discriminated against, there's a bias against them, they didn't get enough money, whatever. And by having full knowledge and training on how to handle those, you're going to eliminate a lot of those problems with employees. Avoiding claims to regular management meetings with full disclosure of issues. If people don't know there's a problem, many times they do the wrong thing and can actually work against the company, not realizing what the company's problem is. In fact, we've had one situation where I worked for a company where management was hiding some financial information, and there was a newspaper man who came to interview one of the executives who was not aware of the situation, and the executive said exactly 180 degrees opposite of what should have been said, and wound up with the company having a major problem, not only in the area of the stock value going down, but the bad publicity and the thought that the company was dishonest when it was a case of a lack of disclosure among members. Management attorneys, if appropriate, and attorneys, again, only if it's appropriate, review client files to avoid claims. If there's anything in the file that's suspicious, let the attorney know. For example, if I'm going through the files of one of my employees, and I find the employee file missing, or I find some papers missing, I immediately notify an attorney. A lot of times, these employees who have full right to see their personnel files will attempt to take things out of it. It could be disciplinary information, or it could be things such as a non-disclosure agreement they signed. If there's no non-disclosure agreement, it's hard to have them held liable for it. So always make sure that someone's verifying that the employees, when they're looking at the personnel file, aren't taking anything. Advising employees on cost-benefit issues regarding litigation, mediation, and settlement. Employees will get you in trouble, and if they understand what they're doing, perhaps they will realize that, again, we don't want to get ourselves in a position of litigation or have settlements. Unfortunately, a lot of employees don't realize that the litigation and settlements cost the company money. They just think of always solving a problem. Some more best methods: document of all contracts with clients, of all contacts with clients included in client files. This includes meetings, phone calls, electronic contacts, and even social events. And yes, even in social events. I also included it with suppliers, and in my company, and when I had worked for large companies, I did the same. Always, everything was documented, so if anything came up, I had documentation. Today, of course, you put it on your phone, but I still tend to write it down in handwriting and then go home and type it up, so it's on my computer. So I have a record on every client I deal with, when I deal with them. And again, if it's a formal meeting, I always send them a letter or an email confirming that meeting, and I put it in the file. If it's informal, such as a cocktail party or a Christmas party, I will again put it in the file. I won't send anything to them unless it's maybe they ask me a question, and then I would send them a question, the answer. I don't want them to take a verbal answer as being the answer. I want it shown that whenever you deal with me, and you get a verbal answer, we'll follow up with a written answer. And I will always keep a little note aside that I told Larry so-and-so, and I sent him an email. So there's no question that as a matter of policy, I always send out what we talk about. And that avoids a lot of litigation right there. Another one is after agreement on action is reached with client, document in a letter or email the conclusions of the meeting and ask their advice if they disagree, or ask them if they don't understand, or it's not completely agreement between what we agreed upon. Again, very good idea. And every time you have that meeting with a client, the email or letter. Now, does it make a difference if it's a letter or email? What I like about email is I know it gets to people. A letter can always say they didn't get it. Of course, you could send it, return receipt requested. Of course, that always makes people suspect and saying, okay, what's the matter here? Email is much more informal. And unfortunately, being much more informal, you can't treat it as informal. The natural tendency is to treat it as informal, but don't when you're dealing with clients or suppliers. Employees should be trained to identify problem clients, methods of dealing with these clients. I don't think you have to be in the industry long to be able to tell what a problem client is. And the best thing to do with a problem client is find that you're no longer qualified to be able to help them with their needs. They have outgrown you. That makes them feel good that they've outgrown you, and they hopefully leave and bother somebody else, not you, and avoid potential grief later on by lawsuits or need to have arbitrations, etc. Or just they're continuously calling you complaining. Keeps you from happening. Best practices, training and use of email messaging for all employees. Emails and messages are thought of as being informal, and that is actually becomes a hindrance after a while because people don't pay attention to what they're putting in it. And I think you've all heard of stories where companies got in trouble because of some emails that they found, or it even happens to politicians, believe it or not. Get the training so people understand what an email really is and the fact that it doesn't disappear. It's going to always be there, and you better make sure that before you send it, you know exactly what it says. And it's a major source of legal issues due to its being informal. I have a friend of mine who used to have a small business where he had a number of people who were hired to go look at emails in a lawsuit. And they would go through a company's entire emails, and this could be a company of 50 people, a couple hundred people. And he would have his people spend time looking at every email they put out. And it's amazing the types of things they found out. Even in many cases disparaging their own company, and became, of course, noticed when the people reviewed all those emails. Finally, use of company's email account, not practitioners' private accounts. Practitioners' private accounts should not be used for anything business related because it's not kept within the business control. In other words, we want everything that the business has controlled by the business so it can be reviewed. And I think our employees should be made aware of the fact that their emails will be reviewed, and have things show up by security or by compliance officers, etc., that we're able to handle it in real time, prevent problems. Shredders should be used for all correspondence messages rather than wastebaskets or recycled. And that, again, is something that I think most companies have today, a policy in that area. Backup at another site required for all emails and messages. For example, I have my messages, etc., from my offices always backed up at my house. Some people have it in the cloud, someplace other than just where your physical site is, because if you're a fire, if there's a theft of your computers, you still want to have that information available. And I've been twice in offices where we've had, during the night, someone came in and stole all our laptops. And of course, if we didn't have the backup, we would have lost all that data. And then finally, on this chart, client file retention should be maintained for indefinite periods. Again, some people say 3 years, 5 years. I say keep it indefinitely. The small space it requires in the cloud, it doesn't matter how long you keep it. And you never know when something comes up. It's been more than once I have had to come up with proof of something that happened 10 years before. And one of these days, someone's going to come up with something that happened 20 years ago. If you got it, you're going to avoid a lot of issues. Our final set of best practices: job descriptions for each employee, which include periodic updates and retraining in the best practices and avoiding litigation topics. I cannot overstress the need for a good job description, so the employee knows exactly what you're really expecting of them and what training they need to have to be able to do their job, and also what they can do to avoid litigation. All of these are things that are very important to today's employees. I can remember back my first job in the aerospace industry. I was hired to work in the contracting area, and I went in my office and they had a book there called Procedures. I opened it up and it was full of love letters. I asked my secretary, what was that about? He said, well, the guy who had your seat before you used to keep his girlfriend's letters here at work because he didn't want his wife to know about it. Well, every time I thought of job descriptions for the next 20 years, I thought of that's a place to put something because no one ever looks into the file. Well, I think today people are looking into the file. They're looking at what the job description is and what they should be doing and not doing. And it should be kept up to date. And if you're not keeping it up to date, you can't blame the employees for doing things that cause trouble for you. And finally, ethics training should be on a yearly basis. If you're dealing with the federal government and many state governments, you're required to have ethics training annually. I think it's just a good practice overall to remind the employees of the duty to follow the ethical rules of the organization and follow the ethical rules of the association, for example, the Financial Planning Association's ethical rules, which we covered in the first module. If you don't remind the people of them, they forget it. And once a year is not too much to ask to spend an hour or two going over ethics and reminding people of the importance of it.